We support the Second Amendment. We don't want the United States to become like Cuba and other countries where they took everyone's firearms and then, the government is oppressive and abusive. Of course, we don't want that. But we also don't want young children to be shot up.
You're listening to TAG, or Talking About Guns as we like to call it. My name is Matt Littman. I'm Executive Director of 97%, a new bipartisan organization working to reduce gun deaths in America. As part of our mission to change the conversation around gun safety, TAG normalizes dialogue about guns. We invite guests from all sides of the gun debate, and we talk about the hot button issues, but without the screaming. Later in this episode, Dr. Michael Siegel, a renowned researcher and professor at Tufts University, joins us for another edition of Siegel Scope as he breaks down exactly which gun laws work and which don't work in the U.S. But first, coming on the heels of several mass shootings that have rocked the nation, Republicans and Democrats came together to pass the most significant federal legislation to address gun violence in nearly 3 decades. So we wanted to speak today with former Republican Congressman Carlos Curbelo, who served Florida's 26th district from 2015 to 2019. He's consistently been ranked as one of the most bipartisan members of Congress, has firsthand experience introducing bipartisan gun legislation in the House, and partnered with 97% board member and fellow TAG guest, Democratic Congressman Seth Moulton from Massachusetts, to ban bump stocks, as well as introduce no-fly, no-buy legislation. He now serves as an on-air analyst for NBC News, Telemundo, and MSNBC, and he's an important member of our 97% advisory board. Congressman Curbelo, welcome to TAG. Thank you for doing this. It's very important that we have you on as a former member of Congress and one known for being bipartisan and for all the work that you've done on gun issues. I have to just start out by asking you, did you think it was at all possible that we were going to get something done this year in Congress on gun issues?
I thought it was possible, but I also thought it was highly unlikely just because we'd seen this happen so many times before with the same outcome, which was nothing. In my particular case, after the Pulse shooting in Orlando, I worked with Senator Collins and some Democrats to try to pass a version of no fly, no buy, a lot more modest than what Democrats had proposed. And, we got some early traction, but then got nowhere. And then after the Las Vegas mass shooting, we tried to just do a simple bump stock ban, worked closely with Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts on that. And again, we got some Republican and Democratic co-sponsors, but the NRA intervened, didn't want Congress to legislate, just wanted the administration at the time to handle it through regulations. And we couldn't do anything. So I kind of felt that this time might be different just because, the aggregate effect is so strong and painful. But I knew there was also a good chance that nothing happened. Thankfully, that wasn't the case.
It's interesting because you mentioned all these mass shootings while you were in Congress, right? I think that those were all while you were in Congress, as well as the
That's
Parkland
right.
shooting. And then in Florida, actually, the state of Florida was able to pass legislation in a bipartisan way. Is that right?
Florida, a very conservative legislature with a very conservative governor at the time, now Senator Rick Scott, did pass some meaningful gun reform here, including raising the age to purchase firearms to 21. So there was a precedent in Florida for Republican-led, forget about bipartisan, Republican-led action to address gun violence. And I would like to think that also contributed to Congress moving this latest piece of legislation.
Contributed because it's an example of how to work in a bipartisan way to get this done?
Well, I think even more than that, it showed that Republicans, despite the objections of special interest groups, can act on gun safety and not face any negative political consequences. I mean, Rick Scott went on to become a senator. all the legislators who voted for that package, they were not penalized in any way. So, sadly, one of the greatest obstacles, if not the greatest obstacle to passing good policy in Congress is the fear of losing a primary or losing any election, really. When legislators act and they don't lose, that is reinforcing and that gives other legislators confidence. So I think that more so than the bipartisanship aspect, which in Florida was not really of great relevance because the Republicans so completely dominate the state government here. I think the fact that it was Republican led and that Republicans didn't face consequences with special interest groups, much less with voters who thought the package that was passed in Florida was perfectly appropriate and reasonable. So I think that really was the stronger message and delivered some positive momentum for gun safety reform.
So then on the federal level, if we're saying that the legislators in Florida were able to pass legislation and did not face negative consequences, that's correct, right? So then on a federal level, and you've done bipartisan legislation yourself, but there has always been this idea on the more on the Republican side, right, that if you passed gun legislation, your seat, as you were saying, you could be primaried or that sort of thing. So is that a myth? Is that not true? You know, we've seen, for example, with John Cornyn, the senator from Texas, that his poll numbers have stayed the same since he led this. So do you think that that's a myth? And do you think that that now we're done with that? Are we past that point that we know that legislation can pass and you can stay in office? Where do you think we are on that?
It's generally a myth, especially when there's a strong group of Republicans in this case working together. So the fact that there were 15 senators, I think that's a healthy number. And of course, Mitch McConnell, who does this from time to time, will deliver his vote more than anything to give his members cover so that they can act. I think that makes it very safe. In the House, I think we had 14. I was hoping we'd have a little more, but House Republicans tend to be more sensitive to political risk. And part of the reason is because they have to go to the ballot every 2 years. So generally, it is a myth that you cannot support sensible gun policy reforms that a lot of most gun owners support. It is a myth that there's great risk in acting. Now, if someone goes out there on their own, perhaps one of these special interest groups will try to make an example of them, and that could certainly be painful or difficult. But as long as people hang out together, like they tell us when we were kids and we were going to go out, stay in a group, then it's generally a myth and not only safe but just very rewarding to do the right thing and to pass policies that could very possibly save lives without disrupting or diminishing the gun rights of law-abiding citizens.
When we talk about this, and this is true for a lot of issues, and as a member of Congress, you must have dealt with this all the time, right? And still do, which is that people assume that if you don't agree with them, you're being paid off, right? That you're corrupt. In other words, the hard work is in convincing people. It's easy to say everybody who disagrees with you is corrupt. That's easy. But the hard work is making an argument and winning that argument. And when we talk about the gun issue as an example, it's very often the case that people just lean on the corruption argument and not on the here's what we need to do and why argument, right? And I think that's true with many issues, which is that we're in this place, I think, as a country where if you don't agree with me, there's something wrong with you that's deeper than the fact that, we're having this conversation.
That is the plain truth right there. Look, let's just move to another issue for a second, just to kind of give us a little more clarity here. I work a lot on climate change. I think it's an important issue. I think that the environment and the economy are one and the same. I don't do it as a quote unquote tree hugger. I just know that it's a threat to the state of Florida, to my area. When I was in Congress, I spent a lot of time on this. So people will say, oh, Republicans don't act on climate because they receive X amount of money from fossil fuel companies. Well, that's just not true. The main reason that a lot of Republicans don't take an interest on climate and the environment is that their voters aren't really aware of the issue. They're not interested. They haven't been educated on it. So you're absolutely right. If we want to find more and better partners in Congress, we have to partner with them to communicate with their voters in their districts, grass tops organizations in their communities, and have them go and speak to their member of Congress, have them meet with their member of Congress and say, look, we've been learning about this issue. We, of course, in the case of gun reform, we support the Second Amendment. We don't want the United States to become like Cuba and other countries where they took everyone's firearms and then, the government is oppressive and abusive. Of course, we don't want that. But we also don't want young children to be shot up every 3 or 4 months in this country. So we support these simple reforms. I mean, that's how we can change things, not by diminishing or disqualifying people by calling them corrupt. I mean, again, campaigns these days cost millions of dollars. The most a lot of these groups can contribute directly to your campaign is $10,000. I didn't know any member of Congress who, for $10,000 campaign contribution, is going to adopt a position on a major issue like gun reform, like abortion, like climate and the environment. That's just not how it works. So we need to be smarter and more sober about how we reach out to members, about how we build coalitions. And I can tell you, you don't build coalitions by disqualifying people. You don't build coalitions by calling people corrupt or labeling them. That just doesn't work.
Right. I think we come from the position generally that most people are good people. They do not want kids in schools to die. Right. And
Right.
so
and they also want to get reelected.
And they also want to get reelected. And what can we do? So one thing that we do, Congressman, is we just provide the information, right? We just say, this is where gun owners are. Here you go. And gun owners and people who don't own guns, generally speaking, are in the same place. I mean, we have research that says, 86% of gun owners favor background checks, for example. 2/3 of gun owners favor red flag laws. You have red flag laws in Florida. You've had thousands and thousands of times that red flag laws have been utilized. Do you see red flag laws in Florida, in your opinion, being helpful in the couple of years you've had it, in a few years?
Definitely. I mean, you don't in this sense, they've been very successful. You don't read any stories about people who has whose guns have been taken away unfairly or without due process. So it really, in the sense that you're not hearing very much about it, it's certainly working well, right? Because that means that probably whenever these red flag laws are being activated or used, it's because there's someone who's really going through a difficult situation, has a mental health disorder, has some kind of violent episode in their lives, and therefore, at least temporarily, they're losing access to firearms. So again, it's like a lot of these things, people, it's always the rumor or the fear of what may happen that drives policymakers. But then when the policy actually goes into effect, it's really not a big deal. Why? Because it's reasonable, because it's sensible, because it makes sense to most people, and because we have institutions and systems in place, the news media being one of them, that would highlight if there were any cases of abuse or of unintended consequences to these policies.
You've never heard, for example, I've never heard Governor DeSantis complaining about red flag laws in Florida.
No, I mean, the entire gun reform package that passed after Parkland, there has been zero criticism from Republicans, from Democrats, from independents. Right. Everyone just accepts that it was common sense, it was the right thing to do, and that we should proceed accordingly going forward.
So it's a great point. Do you see, you had, for example, and I think when you propose the legislation you propose, Congressman, even though it doesn't pass, that's leadership, right? Because you're putting it up there, you're leading your party, you're saying there's a bipartisan way to do this. So you're setting the pathway for the future. So even if this doesn't work on this day, it may in a couple of years. Now, even with all that good work you've done, and some of it with our friend Congressman Seth Moulton, do you see an ability for Congress to do more in the future? Or do you think that we're going to stop now for a while, see how this works, and revisit in a couple of years?
So lawmaking is like exercise. The more you do it, the better you get at it. And I think this last exercise in Congress, where we passed meaningful bipartisan gun safety, gun safety policies, is significant because it was a breakthrough. And yeah, the first time you do anything, whether it's ride a bike or pass a law, is the hardest. And Republicans and Democrats now have a positive experience as a point of reference that they can look back at. And look, hopefully we won't have any more of these types of mass shootings. I doubt it. I hope I'm wrong. We all hope we're wrong. We hope that this movement can disappear because we never have any more violence again related to firearms, but that's highly unlikely. If there's another case that reveals a weakness in the laws, some kind of loophole, some kind of vulnerability, Republicans and Democrats will have a point of reference and say, okay, we've done this before. We sat down, we figured out a way to prevent whatever happened last time. In this case, Uvalde. Let's do it again, right? And it's not like a year ago where there was just no example. Right. And there was just this hopelessness and helplessness. Oh, well, nothing's ever going to happen. Look, all these children and innocent people keep dying and Congress doesn't care. That's not true anymore. That's not true anymore. And that exercise is meaningful. And something else you said, even when laws don't pass, all those other times, after Pulse, after Las Vegas, after Parkland, that lawmakers got together and talked and tried to figure something out, even though they failed, that got us closer to the success that we finally had this time. So we shouldn't, every time Congress fails, of course it's frustrating and disappointing, but we should also understand that those failures are important steps towards success. I tell everyone, again, going back to climate and the environment, we didn't pass any meaningful bills on this issue while I was there, but we blocked a couple amendments on the House floor that were extremely negative for environmental policy. We started a caucus and had 45 Democrats and 45 Republicans sign their names to it. All of these are steps that get you closer to the goal of passing meaningful policy that will actually make a big difference. So I know, especially for younger people, they may not have the patience to let Congress function the way our founding fathers intended for it to function, but it's really the only way. So we should focus on it and celebrate it and try to encourage good policy making as often as possible.
Thank you. And I'm just going to throw out 3 softball questions at you, Congressman. The first softball question is, given all this and all the work that you've done, do you miss being in Congress?
I miss my friends. I miss the opportunity to work on policy. In terms of me and my family, I honestly don't miss Congress. my personal quality of life has been much better since leaving Congress. Congress, with some exceptions, like this latest gun reform package, the bipartisan infrastructure bill. There was some collaboration during the pandemic, but those were exceptions.
Yeah.
Congress has been a miserable place, and I'm not saying this as an outsider. I'm just repeating what a lot of Republicans and Democrats who are my friends and are still there tell me. It's a difficult place, especially for those lawmakers who are working in the deal space, who want to reach compromises on gun policy, on environmental policy, on tax policy. It's just a very difficult place for members who have that disposition. Now, that doesn't mean we should give up. I certainly didn't. I was involuntarily retired. I didn't walk away. But it's just not an attractive place for people to go to work these days, unless you just want to be on TV and get a lot of attention. Then it's a perfect place for people who want to do that.
Right. There's a lot of room for that. Next question is we ask everybody when they come on to tag somebody that they'd like us to have on as a guest in the future. We've had Congressman Moulton on, for example, your friend. Can you think of anybody that you'd like to tag that we should have on after you?
So I recommend Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy of Orlando. She's a Democrat who enjoys working in this deal space, in the bipartisan space. While we were in Congress together, she took a leadership role in changing government policies so that the CDC could research and study the issue of gun violence as a public health issue. And that used to be banned in the past. And Stephanie just kept at it. It seemed like something modest. Most Democrats said, well, that's not enough. You're wasting your time. But she, again, understood that it was an important step in making progress on this issue. And she got it done. So I think she's kind of
She's a great
someone
one.
perfect.
Is she not running for re-election?
She's retiring. She's not running for re-election. Her district was changed. She had thought about running for Senate, decided against it. So she's stepping away for now. I hope she decides to step back in at some point. But I think she has a great perspective on this issue and a history of success on
We'll
it as well.
definitely reach out to her. My final question for you, Congressman, is I see your shirt. Tell us why University of Miami, the U, is a great university.
Well, the U, and of course, most people think football when they think of the U, and they should, even though it's also a wonderful academic school. But we're really excited about our football program next year. We have a new coach in Mario Cristobal. We think he's really going to bring us back to being one of the great.
He was the coach at Oregon.
Yeah, he was at Oregon where he had a successful run. We're happy to welcome him home. And aside from that, Miami's just a great school, and it's in a city that has become the center of the universe here during and after the pandemic. A lot of people moving here. Too many people, it feels like some days, because traffic is horrible. But we're happy to welcome so many people here. This is, I think, the most welcoming city in all of the United States. No matter where you're from, you can feel at home in Miami.
University of Miami is a great school. Miami is a great city, and you have been a great guest and a great leader on the gun issues. So thank you for joining us today, Congressman, on TAG.
Wonderful to be with you. And again, let's celebrate that big gun reform victory. Our country is going to be better off for it.
Thank you, Congressman. We'll now turn it over to Dr. Michael Siegel for our new segment called Siegel Scope. Dr. Siegel, a Tufts University public health professor, has published dozens of innovative studies examining gun ownership and gun policy. He joins us to magnify what the natural eye can't see, what years of dedicated research proves about some of the most hot-button issues in the gun space. Now that we've discussed the current legislation with Congressman Curbelo, Dr. Siegel is going to break down exactly which gun laws work and which don't, based on the research that he's conducted. Dr. Siegel, welcome.
Thank you, Matt. Today on Siegel Scope, I'd like to talk about the effectiveness of gun laws and try to answer the very basic question, what laws work and what laws don't work. We're going to focus on two major outcomes: firearm suicide and firearm homicide. And these make up about 99% of all firearm deaths. So first of all, there are four basic firearm laws that there is robust evidence have a strong deterrent effect on firearm violence. The first one is called the violent misdemeanor law. And basically, these are laws that say that if someone has a history of a conviction for any violent offense at any level, that person is not eligible to either purchase or possess a gun. Currently, under federal law, if you commit a violent offense, you are perfectly welcome to purchase or possess as many guns as you like, as long as that crime did not rise to the level of a felony. So you could have committed a violent assault and battery. You could be stalking someone, cyber stalking. You could have made threats of physical violence. As long as you weren't convicted of a felony, as long as it was only at the misdemeanor level, then you are perfectly free, according to federal law, to carry a gun. And so this is a major loophole. Some of the states have tried to address this loophole by issuing may issue laws. And those may issue laws basically give police discretion to say to people applying for concealed carry permits, no, you don't have a felony, but we happen to know from our local records that you have committed violent misdemeanor crimes. And so therefore, we're going to deny you a license. We'll talk in a minute about the Supreme Court decision that essentially nullifies may issue laws and what the consequences of that are. Our research found that violent misdemeanor laws reduce firearm homicides by about 18%. So we're talking about a huge effect here. The second law that we found is effective is a combination of universal background checks and a requirement for a permit to purchase or possess a gun. We found that the combination of universal background checks and permits reduces firearm homicide by 15%. The third effective law is may issue laws. We found that these laws are associated with a 9% reduction in firearm homicide. And this is where the Supreme Court comes in. So the Supreme Court recently ruled in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin that you cannot make having good character or having a special need to purchase it, to have a gun, a requirement for a constitutionally protected right, like owning a gun. So may issue laws are essentially not going to be viewed as being consistent with that decision. And so the first question is, well, what can states do that have a may issue law in place? If you spell out very clearly what the criteria are, and you include all violent crimes, including misdemeanors, then you've essentially included all of the criteria that are important in identifying people who are at the highest risk for violence. And so the need for a may issue law is no longer there. Well, there's one other law that is overwhelmingly found to be effective, and that's red flag laws. They're most useful in the situation of someone who is depressed, maybe suicidal, and has a gun. The family becomes aware of it, they notify law enforcement, and law enforcement is able to temporarily remove the gun from the person. They have a hearing, of course, with due process. And in most cases, the subjects of these orders are actually grateful for this intervention and are happy to have mental health help and treatment. We found that the combination of these four laws, we estimate, would reduce firearm homicide by 35% and would reduce suicide rates by 15%. Now let's talk about the other side. What are the laws that don't work? Well, the most important law for which we found no substantial effect are assault weapon bans. We found that assault weapons bans have no significant effect on firearm homicide or firearm suicide. And in fact, we looked in particular at mass shootings and found that bans on assault weapons don't even prevent mass shootings. The other laws that we found pretty much unequivocally don't reduce firearm homicide are magazine bans, ammunition magazine capacity size bans. Although these bans, our research found, are effective in reducing the number of casualties in a mass shooting, they don't actually do anything to prevent the mass shooting from occurring. One gun per month laws that limit the number of guns that you can buy in a month, for example, we didn't find any effect of those laws. The way I would synthesize this would be to say that laws that try to regulate the what are ineffective, and laws that regulate the who can be effective. What do I mean by that? By the what, I mean the type of weapon. Regulating the type of weapon or the number of weapons that you can buy doesn't seem to be effective. And this makes some conceptual sense, because it doesn't really matter what weapon you have. What's important is the risk that that person is going to use the weapon. And so if you regulate the who, meaning that you regulate who can have access to guns, and specifically, if you focus in on the highest risk for violence, which we know is a history of violence, and you have a very strong prohibitor saying, if you've committed an act of violence in the past, you are not eligible to purchase or possess a gun. That is the most effective thing you can do. Keeping guns out of the hands of people who are at the highest risk for violence is really and should really be the hallmark of an overall gun violence prevention policy. Thank you for joining me for Siegel Scope, and back to you, Matt.
I'm Matthew Lippman, your host of TAG. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did, we'd love for you to subscribe to us at Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. You're welcome to rate us as well. Give us a follow on Instagram and Twitter at 97%org, and tag who you'd like us to interview next. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.